So the whole point here is that while GSA, the sigma pushes people to the table, trading can keep them there. It can hold them there. There's going to be tensions, obviously. There's going to be, tense words. There's going to be people storming out of the room. The people come back to the room, and trust emerges, through this inclusive, transparent process over time. Keeping these principles in mind of the defined access, defensible shares, and making sure that those are divestible. As you heard from Ellen, that can really help speed things up, the path to sustainability. Again, just another way of articulating these, of these three principles. Clearly defined share allocations, transparent accountability, of making what had been face-to-face transparent through some of what you've seen of the vendors out there. They're now able to make what had to be face-to-face, they can now make that visible. They can make the hidden clear, and credit trading. Again, borrowing from EDF, quite literally, we set out to then write this guidebook, not a rules book, but a guidebook that can help people define that process of designing a market. So again, starting from scratch, defining. How do you define this? And they want that right from the start. But before you define who gets how much, you got to say, where do we want to go? Do we want to preserve the rural character? Do we want to restore these ecosystems or just sort of keep them where they are now? Do we want to attract tourism? Do we want to build up this sector? All those crazy questions, get them on the table, because that's the key. It makes a lot of things easier further on. Defining the boundaries, not just the basin, but where the hydrology is going on. And this is interesting because people outside the defined basin may be able to contribute through a market to the replenishment to the plant, even though they don't have to, if there's some incentives in it for them. And this is where it really comes down, defining that allocation process. Who gets to participate? How do you divide up that pie? And one of the things we'd found from fisheries that can apply here is don't necessarily think in terms of acre feet. Don't necessarily think just in terms of acreage. Think in terms of percentages. Percentages allow that flexibility and also allows people to think forward. If there's concerns about, the big farmer, the Buddy Gwendon of fishery, taking over and creating a monopoly, that's when you can start defining not just sectoral allocations like, okay, this much for agriculture, this percentage for industry, this percentage for the utilities, but you can also set concentration caps around individual stakeholders. A concentration cap is basically a buffer saying, as in fisheries, Buddy's great, he's been catching 6% of the fishery, but we don't want him to buy up the rest of us and just sort of have this fishery all to himself, even though he probably could. So he can't, no one, not just him, no one can own more than 6.5% of the basin, of the fishery. And we discussed similar kinds of concentration caps in Sonoma. Who can participate? Is it just for individual well owners? Is it for entities? Is it for people who haven't even come into the basin? Can we create set-asides, reserves? How do we create these, know what's going to be happening? Well, create a buffer and make sure that you've allowed your system to breathe. And then again, defending. Oh gosh, a lot of these meters don't, a lot of these pumps don't even have meters. It was the same thing with fishermen. We don't know what they're catching out there, how much they're shoving back into the water. And the fishermen didn't want people to know because, they had to feed their family. They had to make it work somehow. What was interesting with fisheries is once they converted to a defined system with defensible rules that they could later divest, they started demanding cameras. They wanted more accountability. They started sharing data with one another because it was in their self-interest to do so. We now have these extraordinary tools, not just meters, but remote sensing and combinations of these. And again, I want to refer you to the other vendors that are able to make this possible. And it's not just a one-time thing. It's just not on the front end. It is an ongoing process. That circle, when does this stop? It doesn't stop. It keeps going. You want to have this accountability, this feedback that allows for enforcement, that allows for flags to come up early and people to say, hang on, is this working? Are we moving in the right direction? Yeah, okay, we're in the yellow here. We got to move back into the green. And not just on social issues, not just on economic issues, not just on environmental issues, but on market integrity. Is the market working for us? Is it reaching those goals that we determined right from the start? And lastly, the divestment. It's basically a way of constantly being able to vote on priorities of what's water worth. Who decides that? Well, we all decide that. We can decide at different times, in different ways, but the main thing is it gets people thinking ahead. Instead of just day to day, like they did with fishermen, to start thinking a year ahead, planning their business, thinking about, okay, well, the value of water right now is this. What if I put in drip irrigation? What if I changed it? What if we did recharge? And you're able then to start thinking in this dynamic context, and this is just a snapshot. It's not a, this is fixed for all time, but a comparison of the different sources of water. And again, as Ellen said earlier today, some of these are pretty expensive. You can get them, but you're going to pay out the nose for them, when trading could bring you a supply that is not just secure and equitable, but a lot more affordable. So just coming full circle, that the gains from trade, as you've heard again and again, it's not just economic. The gains from trade are about flexibility, about inclusiveness, about making sure that the disadvantaged people have a voice and they have rights defined on the front end. It's about making sure that the GDEs are defined and are functioning and aren't just going to get short shrift. That it's not just, money talks and then everybody else is sort of silenced. It allows the planning ahead about some level of business certainty to say, okay, well, we could actually start thinking of water as a crop. We could start selling what we save if we did this and this and this. Sacramento doesn't know what this and this is, but people do. People can figure that out on their own, having that flexibility. Also, for crops saying, we're going to need more water, where are we going to get that from if we're not going to get some exports, if we're not going to be able to have more snow melts? Where's it going to come from? Well, we can come from within our community. And I think I know who I could talk to about that. Coming back to some of the three outcomes, that this transparent, platform, these markets that you might create can help unlock resiliency, as long as they're done out in the open. The transactions can ease these tensions over these potential costs, over the pain points, over the uncertainty, and making sure that there's equity right from the start. And again, this is a low risk path to building trust. And trust isn't meaning like, I'm going to agree with this person on everything. You probably never will. In Sonoma, the guys that have been talking around the table for 5-10 years, they still disagree, but they trust one another. And I think that can be built up through the process. So the story where we started, again, these quaint, illiterate, innumerate people, and this is the wise matriarch who sacrificed for her family, that has proven so effective, so resilient for so many people over so long a time, has a direct bearing on how you guys can shape your decisions here. She said, when I was young, we got our water from each other, from the roots, from the animals. And then the government came and started providing water. And then the government took away that water. And I think it was to make us dependent on them and force us to move. She didn't want to move. I don't think anyone, living in California necessarily wants to move. They don't want to give up their farm. They don't want to give up the environment. They don't want to give up their rights, their well that they worked so hard for. And she showed a way that you don't have to. And that's the story that I wanted to share with you today.